The field turned black before breakfast. Not brown, not shadowed, black. A living sheet of wings rolled down over Ruth Harrow's potato rows until every green leaf seemed to disappear beneath feathers. Birds crowded the bean poles, hopped between the squash hills, and poured into the young corn with the sound of dry cloth being shaken by 1,000 hands. Ruth stood at the gate with a tin scoop of chicken feed in her fist, unable to move. Behind her, Eli Harrow came out of the barn at a run, saw the field, and stopped so hard his boots slid in the dust. "That's our winter," he said. Then the birds rose all at once, only a few feet, turned in a black wave, and settled again. Eli reached for the shotgun over the door. Ruth caught his sleeve. "No," she said. He stared at her as if she had spoken in fever. "No. Ruth, they'll strip it bare." But Ruth was not looking at the field the way he was. She was looking at the birds. And the terrible thing was, they were not acting like thieves. 6 weeks earlier, before the heat cracked the creek bed, and before the neighbors stopped laughing, Mercy Lorne had leaned both elbows on Ruth's fence and watched her set ash around the cabbage starts. Mercy was nearly 70, bone thin, and bent by a life of weather. Her hands looked like root wood. Her eyes missed nothing. "You keep asking the soil to explain itself," Mercy said. Ruth smiled without looking up. "Wouldn't that be useful?" "It already does," the old woman said. "Only it doesn't speak in words. It speaks in what gathers, what leaves, what dies, and what comes back." Ruth had laughed then, because April still made a person foolish with hope. She would remember the sentence in July, when the whole lower claim seemed to breathe beneath feathers. The Harrow place lay on the west edge of Cinder Creek, in a country where grass survived better than people, and the wind had opinions about everything. Ruth and Eli had taken the claim 4 years earlier with 2 mules, a cracked stove, and the kind of hope that looks noble only after it succeeds. It had not succeeded yet. Their sod house stayed damp in spring and dusty in summer. Their wheat came thin. Their well gave just enough if no one wasted a cup. But below the house, on the flat black ground near the creek, Ruth had coaxed a kitchen field from stubborn earth. Potatoes, beans, turnips, squash, cabbage, sweet corn, onions, and 1 brave strip of melons. It was not much to look at from the road. Half the neighbors called it a woman's patch, as if that made it smaller. Ruth knew better. That field was flour, seed, cellar food, trade food, and the difference between borrowing through winter and standing upright in spring. Eli broke the wider acres. Ruth studied the kitchen field. She did not call it study, not at first. She only kept the old flour ledger no store would take back, marking frost dates, wind direction, which rose yellowed first, which leaves held beetles, which remedies failed, and which failed more slowly. She pinned seed packets to the wall. She buried fish scraps under the corn. She planted mustard at the row ends, because bugs seemed to prefer it before they found the cabbage. She set boards between the potato rows and lifted them at dawn to see what hid beneath. The neighbors found this funny. Silas Mott, whose farm sat across the creek, farmed by certainty. His father had planted corn a certain way, so Silas planted corn that way. His father had laughed at kitchen experiments, so Silas laughed too. The Enderly brothers down the road laughed less cruelly, but just as loudly. Only Mercy Lorne did not laugh. Mercy watched, and sometimes, when Ruth thought she was alone, she saw the old woman standing at the edge of the lane with that cane in the dust, studying the field, as if it were speaking to both of them. The trouble began with the potatoes. At first it was nothing more than a notch bitten from a leaf, then another. Then a whole corner of a row looked lace-cut overnight. Ruth blamed beetles until she found the curled gray bodies at the base of the stems. Cutworms, fat ones. Then wireworms in the soil. Then pale grubs under the bean roots. Then a red-brown beetle she had never seen before, shining like a drop of old blood on the underside of a cabbage leaf. She wrote all of it down. June 19th, first cutworms in South Potato Row. June 21st, beetles in mustard trap strip. June 23rd, wireworms under beans. More after hot wind. By the end of June, every kitchen field along Cinder Creek had the same injuries. People did not say much about it at first. Farmers will talk all day about rain they want and never mention the disaster already chewing at their feet. Ruth mentioned it to the ledger. Then, on the first Monday of July, the sky changed. She heard them before she saw them. Not a song, not a caw, not the neat call of geese. A rolling, restless clatter, as if the morning itself had filled with small hinges. Ruth looked east. A black ribbon moved along the creek line, bending and folding over itself. It widened as it came. It split around the cottonwoods, joined again, and dropped from the sky all at once. Blackbirds, thousands of them. Red-winged blackbirds, grackles, cowbirds, and starlings mixed into one traveling hunger. They came down so thick the potato field vanished. Eli was already beside her. For one long breath, neither of them spoke. Then he said the words any sensible man would have said. "We're ruined." He turned for the shotgun. Ruth grabbed his sleeve. Wait. Wait for what? For them to show us what they came for. They came for the field. That may not mean what you think it means. By then, Silas Mott had seen the flock from across the creek. He rode over without a saddle, hat flying loose, shouting before he reached the gate. "Drive them! For God's sake, Eli, drive them before they leave stems." The Enderly brothers came behind him, one carrying a pan to bang with a spoon. Their faces shone with the fear, half relief of men watching disaster choose someone else first. Eli lifted the shotgun. Ruth stepped in front of it. "Give me 1 hour," she said. Silas laughed sharply. 1 hour? Woman, in 1 hour they'll eat the roots. Ruth did not answer him. She opened the gate and walked into the field. The birds shifted around her boots like water around stones. Some lifted, most did not. Their black bodies flashed blue and violet where the sun touched them. Red shoulders flickered in the corn like sparks. The noise should have frightened her. Instead, what frightened her was how focused they were. A bird that steals grain jerks upward. It grabs, gulps, fights, and pulls. These birds were not pulling at the corn. They were stepping low between the stems. Their beaks stabbed at the dirt, at the base of the potato plants, under the cabbage leaves, along the bean roots. Ruth knelt. A red-winged blackbird beside her drove its beak into a potato hill and came up with a gray cutworm. It swallowed, dipped again, and brought up another. A grackle tugged a wireworm from the cracked soil as neatly as a needle from cloth. Ruth reached for the nearest cabbage leaf. The holes were there, but old. No fresh edge, no wet chew mark. She turned the leaf over and found where the beetle eggs had been. The bird beside her had already cleaned them off. "Ellie," she called. He could barely hear her over the wings. "Put the gun down." He did not. So she stood with the leaf in her hand and shouted harder. "They are not eating the crop. They're eating what is eating the crop." Silas swore. One Enderly brother banged the pan anyway, and a corner of the flock lifted in alarm. Ruth spun toward the fence. "Stop that." Something in her voice startled even Eli. The spoon went quiet. Eli crossed the gate slowly, shotgun lowered now but not set aside. He came into the potato row and knelt where Ruth pointed. He watched one bird take a worm, then another, then another. He dug into the soil with 2 fingers and found the empty tunnels where wireworms had been. His face changed. Not into belief, not yet, into the first uncomfortable crack in disbelief. At the fence, Silas shouted, "You both lost your minds." Eli looked at the field again. Black birds. Green stems. Old damage. No new tearing. Then he opened the shotgun, took out both shells, and put them in his pocket. "We're letting them feed," he said. That was the beginning of the name. By noon, half of Cinder Creek had heard that Eli Harrow had surrendered his crop to a plague of blackbirds because his wife had told him to. By supper, the name had reached the store. Blackbird Ruth. It was not meant kindly. Ruth did not have time to mind. The flock did not leave that afternoon. It rose in waves, crossed the creek, turned back, and settled again. At dusk it poured into the cottonwoods until the branches bent under the weight of it. In the morning, before Ruth had finished drawing water, the birds dropped back into the field and began again. That second morning, Ruth understood something important. A flock that size could save a field. It could also crush one. If they stayed too long in the same row, they bruised leaves and flattened vines. If they crowded the beans, poles bent. If they landed in the melons, the young vines snapped under their feet. They were not a miracle. They were a force. A force had to be read. She set out 9 shallow pans along the field's edges, pie tins, a cracked milk pan, the lid from an old lard bucket, and 2 dented plates, no longer fit for the table. She filled them from the well, and then scattered a thin line of cracked millet from the worst potato row toward the mustard strip. Eli watched from the fence. "Are you feeding them or leading them?" "Yes," Ruth said. By the 3rd day, the birds had learned the pans. They drifted toward water in the heat, drank, then fed closest to where they stood. Ruth began moving the pans a few feet each morning. She did not drive the birds. She invited them. A spoon of millet here, a pan of water there, a strip of shade left undisturbed, a row uncovered long enough to rest. Another opened when the worms rose in the cool hour before sunset. Eli began to help. He had once teased the ledger, but now he carried it in his back pocket and asked where she wanted the pans. He walked through the flock with his big hands held low, scattering grain so lightly it looked like he was salting the earth. The birds learned him. They parted and closed and muttered around his boots. From the road it looked ridiculous. Silas Mott made sure everyone knew it. At the store, he said Eli had become hired help to a flock of thieves. At church, one of the Enderly brothers asked if Ruth would be teaching the birds to milk next. Laughter followed her down the steps. Ruth smiled politely and went home to count cabbage leaves. The counting mattered. Before the birds came, fresh chewing marked 7 leaves out of 10 in the south potato rows. After 4 days, it was 2 out of 10. After 8 days, 1 out of 30. The mustard trap strip, which had been alive with beetles, stood strangely clean. Beans that had begun to yellow lifted again. The cabbage hearts tightened. The corn kept its color when the fields around it looked tired by noon. Mercy Lorne came every evening. She did not praise. Mercy considered praise a thing that made people stop watching. She sat on an upturned crate at the lane edge and pointed with her cane when Ruth missed something. "That pan is dry white. The birds are avoiding that corner. Those beans are better. Do not let them stand underweight tomorrow." Once, as the flock rolled from the potatoes to the corn in one dark sweep, Mercy nodded to herself. "My grandmother said birds like these used to follow the bugs along the low ground," she said. "People used to be grateful when the sky came down hungry." "Why did they stop being grateful?" Ruth asked. Mercy looked across the creek, where Silas Mott was beating beetles from his corn with a willow branch and losing the battle. Because fear has a louder voice than memory. By the 2nd week, The Harrow field had become the valley's shame. No one called it that, but Ruth felt it in the way the road grew quiet when she came to the store, the way women stopped asking after her vegetables, the way men leaned on the mill rail and stared at the black flock feeding in her green rows. The other fields were failing, not all at once. Worse than that, slowly, stubbornly, in a way that gave hope each morning and took it again by dark. Potato vines collapsed, first on the Mott place. The Enderley beans yellowed from the roots. Cabbage heads softened before they filled. Corn, that looked fair from the road, showed worm-bored ears when the husks were pulled back. Everyone had done what they were supposed to do. That was the unforgivable part. They had planted straight, hoed clean, trusted the usual remedies, and laughed at Ruth's ledger. Now the usual remedies were failing, and Ruth's ridiculous black field was alive. There were losses in it. She would not have lied about that. Birds bruised leaves. Birds snapped bean tips. Birds stole some grain when she scattered too much. Once they tore into the sweet corn tassels, and she spent a whole afternoon shifting water pans to pull them out of that section. But the field lived, more than lived. It thickened. The potato vines stood like dark green quilts. The beans hung long and clean. Cabbages closed into tight, pale fists. Squash vines climbed over the paths. When Ruth walked the rows at dawn, the ground beneath the plants looked worked over, searched, almost combed. The birds had turned the plague inside out, and Ruth had learned how to keep them from turning the cure into another ruin. She wrote it all. July 9th. Birds feed hardest before heat, move water before sunrise. July 12th. Millet trail works better than corn. Corn brings greed. July 14th. Do not lead flock into beans after noon. Vines break more when leaves wilt. July 17th. Damage falling everywhere, except North Melon Strip. Need water there. The ledger stopped being a habit. It became proof. Proof mattered because by late July, fear had found a new story. Silas Mott told men at the mill that the Harrow birds were the reason the valley had worms. He said no field could stay green under a black cloud unless the thing was unnatural. He said, those birds must have carried sickness from somewhere else and settled it into everyone's soil. The fact that Ruth had written down cut worms before the flock arrived did not interest him. Facts rarely comfort a man who needs blame more than truth. The first cruelty was small. Someone opened the Harrow gate in the night and let a mule into the melon strip. Eli found hoof cuts through 6 vines at dawn. The second was smaller and worse. At church, a woman Ruth had traded soap with for 3 years pulled her child away when Ruth reached to admire the girl's ribbon. Then came the word, not spoken to Ruth's face, never that. It moved behind her like a snake in grass. Witch. Mercy heard it first and told her plain, you are not in danger because the field is strange. Mercy said, you are in danger Because it is working. Ruth did not answer. Across the field, 9,000 birds rose at the shadow of a hawk, turned together so sharply the sky flashed purple-black, and dropped again when the danger passed. Mercy leaned on her cane. They will leave soon. Ruth's mouth tightened. I know. She had known for 3 mornings and had not said it to Eli. The flock was thinning. Not enough for a neighbor to count. Enough for Ruth to feel it. The edges were lighter. The sound at dawn was smaller. More birds lifted south and did not circle back. Some old clock inside them had begun to pull. The crop was not ready. The potatoes needed another 2 weeks. The cabbages needed the same. The beans had begun to fill, but the seed pods were still green. If the birds left too soon, the worms would rise again into a field that had spent its strength recovering. Ruth tried to hold the flock with water. It helped for a day. She tried millet at dusk. It helped for an evening. But migration is older than hunger, older than farms, older than any woman with a ledger. The birds listened politely, fed where she invited them, and still looked south. Then came the confrontation. It was a breathless morning, hot before sunrise, the kind that makes animals short-tempered and men worse. Ruth was moving water pans when she heard hooves on the lane. Silas Mott rode in front. Behind him came 4 men from the creek road, and both Enderly brothers. One carrying a shotgun across his lap, not pointed at anyone, but visible enough to do the work of being seen. Eli came out of the barn with a hammer in his hand. Silas stopped at the gate. "We've had enough," he said. Ruth stood in the potato row, her skirt dark with well water. Enough of what? Enough of that flock roosting here and fouling the whole creek. Enough of pretending it's providence when it's plain trouble. Enough of our gardens dying while yours fattens under black wings. Eli stepped forward. Our field is alive because the birds ate the worms. Your field is alive because something is wrong with it, Silas snapped. And if you won't drive them, we will. Ruth looked past him to the men behind. She knew their faces. She had sat with their wives through fever nights. Eli had lent them tools. They had helped raise the Harrow roof after the spring storm. Now they would not meet her eyes. That hurt more than Silas. Ruth climbed the fence slowly and stood in the lane. "You came here scared," she said. "I do not blame you for that. Your cellars are going to be thin. Your children will feel it. Mine will too, if this field fails." No one spoke, but you have the story backward. The worms were here before the birds. I have dates. I have rows. I can show you where they started and where the birds cleared them. If you drive this flock today, I need crew. You will not heal one field in this creek. You will only ruin the last one, with seed enough to help the rest. Silas's jaw worked. "Always that ledger," he said. "Always you knowing better. I know what I wrote down. You think paper feeds people? "No," Ruth said. "But memory does, when pride stops throwing it away." The words landed hard, too hard. The Enderly brother with the shotgun shifted. Eli saw it. Ruth saw Eli see it. For one thin second, the whole lane seemed to hold its breath. Then a sound cracked across the flats. Not a gunshot. Wood breaking. A shout followed. Then another. From the creek road, Mercy Lorne's hired boy came running full tilt, one hand waving over his head. "Bridge gave," he cried. "At Mott's Crossing, teams in the wash." Silas turned so sharply, his mule sidestepped. The old plank crossing below his place had split under a loaded wagon. 2 horses were caught in the harness, thrashing in the shallow wash where the creek had cut the bank steep. A man could lose a team that way, lose the wagon, lose the sacks of seed grain on it, lose everything still movable after the failed crop. The quarrel broke apart. Men wheeled their horses. Eli dropped the hammer and ran for rope. Ruth ran too, behind them, startled by shouting, hooves, and the sudden rush of bodies. The Blackbirds rose, the whole flock. It lifted in one enormous dark breath, wider than the field, wider than the house, turning the sunlight dim. The birds circled once over Cinder Creek. Then the old pull inside them took command. They streamed south in a long, ragged river. By the time Ruth reached the road, the sky above her field was empty. They saved the team. It took every man at the crossing, both Enderly boys waist-deep in mud, Eli on the bank with a rope around his shoulders, Silas down in the wash-cutting harness leather with shaking hands. Ruth held the horses' heads when they panicked. Mercy's hired boy ran for more rope. By noon, the wagon was dragged clear. 2 sacks lost to the mud, but the seed grain mostly saved. No one mentioned birds. No one mentioned blame. But when Ruth walked home in the late afternoon, her shoes dried stiff with creek clay, she saw the field from the rise and knew the truth before she reached the gate. Green, still green, but quiet. The silence of it broke her harder than damage would have. For weeks, the field had muttered and rustled and breathed in black feathers. Now every leaf seemed exposed. Every stem waited uncovered. At dusk, she found fresh cutworm damage in the north potatoes. At dawn, she found beetles under the cabbage. By the second morning, she found wireworms in a bean root. Eli stood beside her with dirt on his palms and said nothing. Ruth opened the ledger and looked at the pages. So long the lines blurred. "I thought they were the answer," she said. Eli shook his head. They were part of it. She wanted to be comforted and was not, because part of an answer is still gone when it leaves. That night Ruth did not sleep. She sat at the table while Eli breathed heavily on the bed, and the lantern burned low. She turned the ledger from the first spring on the claim to the newest page. Failures. Mostly failures. Ash helped only if repeated after wind. Salt harmed the beans. Tobacco water burned young cabbage. Mustard drew beetles, but had to be pulled before flowering. Boards trapped cutworms if checked before sunrise. Deep fall, turning exposed grubs to frost and birds. Late planting avoided one pest and invited another. Corn near squash confused some beetles. Clean rows looked tidy, but left pests nowhere else to go but the crop. 3 years of stubborn little facts. The flock had been dramatic. The flock had been visible. The flock had made neighbors stare. But the flock had not taught Ruth to notice. It had only rewarded what she had already learned. Before dawn, she closed the ledger and woke Eli. "Get the wagon." He lifted his head, confused and hollow-eyed. "Why? Because if this field is all that lives, then the field is no longer only ours." He stared at her, then he understood. Morning came white and still. No wind, no birds, no mercy in the light. Ruth took the ledger to Silas Mott's yard. He was standing near the broken wagon, rubbing mud from a harness strap. When he saw her, shame crossed his face, so plainly she almost pitied him. Then suspicion covered it. "If you came for an apology," he said, "I don't have one shaped yet. I did not come for apology." She climbed down from the wagon with the ledger under her arm. "I came for your garden." Silas frowned. Ruth walked past him to the ruined rows beside his house. The cabbage had collapsed into itself. Potato vines lay yellow and limp. The bean leaves were specked and torn. She knelt and turned the soil. There they were, grubs tucked beneath dead roots, wireworms in the damp underlayer, egg clusters on the few leaves, not yet gone brown, not a curse, not a mystery, not punishment, only life answering conditions. Ruth held out her palm. Silas looked at the pale bodies moving there. "These will still be here in spring," she said. "If you pretend this summer was bad luck, they will be waiting for you. If you turn deep after the first frost, plant trap rows early, check boards at dawn. Rotate the potatoes out of this ground, and stop burning every scrap of edge growth. You can cut them down before they cut you down." Silas stared at her hand. Behind them, his wife came to the door with a baby on her hip. Ruth softened her voice. "I can show you the rest." Word moved faster than anger. By noon, the Enderly brothers had come to the Mott fence. By mid-afternoon, 3 women from the lower road stood with aprons over their heads against the sun, while Ruth opened the ledger on a fence post and read what she had learned. She did not make it pretty. She did not pretend it was easy. She showed them where to dig, what to look for, which eggs meant beetles, which worm cut stems and which one bored roots. She showed them how to lay boards in the evening and lift them at first light. How mustard could take the first wave if it was sacrificed in time. How deep turning in fall was not tidiness but war. How a row of flowers could draw damage away from food. How water stress made plants lose the fight faster. How a person could lose a whole crop while still doing everything his father had taught him. That last sentence quieted the men. It was not accusation. It was mercy. Mercy. Lorne arrived near sunset, leaning on her cane, and stood at the back of the crowd. Ruth saw her and felt suddenly like the girl she had been in April, kneeling with ash around cabbage starts. Mercy did not speak. She only tapped the cane once against the ground. That was enough. The last 2 weeks of summer became work without pride. The Harrow field still needed saving. Without birds, Ruth and Eli fought by hand. Boards went down every evening. Worms were picked every dawn into a jar of kerosene. Mustard strips were pulled and burned. Water was carried to the weakest rows. The beans were tied again where birds had loosened them. The potatoes were dug early from the worst corner and left longer where the vines still held. Neighbors came, not at first with apologies. Apology is sometimes too large to carry in daylight. They came with hands. Silas sent his oldest boy to help lift boards. Mrs. Mott brought a pan of biscuits and said only, "For the work." The Enderly brothers hauled water one evening and did not make a joke the whole time. Mercy came every day, sat at the lane, and watched the new army of embarrassed helpers move through Ruth's rows. The harvest was not the miracle it might have been. The birds leaving early had cost them. The melons were half what Ruth hoped. Some cabbage never headed. The north potatoes came small, but the beans dried clean. The corn filled enough to save. The squash kept longer than expected. And from that half-acre kitchen field came more sound seed than all the creek's ruined gardens together. Eli laid the sacks on the house floor and counted. Ruth said nothing. She already knew what had to happen. That evening, they divided the seed, not foolishly, not so generously that they doomed themselves. Ruth measured what she and Eli needed for winter food and spring planting. Then she took the rest and made packets from old newspaper and flour sacks, bean seed, cabbage seed, corn, squash, mustard for trap rows. With each packet, she folded a copied page from the ledger. What to plant where, when to turn the soil, where to set the boards, what the eggs looked like, what to pull, what to spare, and what to watch. The next day, families came to the Harrow door. Some came ashamed, some came hungry enough to step over shame. Silas Mott came last. He stood on the stoop with his hat in both hands. He looked older than he had in July. "I was wrong," he said. Ruth handed him seed. Yes. The word struck him, but she did not sharpen it. Then she placed the copied page on top. Turn that lower garden after the first hard frost. Move potatoes to the west strip. Plant mustard before cabbage, not after, and leave a little rough growth beyond the beans. Not everything untidy is your enemy. Silas looked down at the packet. "They called you Blackbird Ruth," he said. "They did. I let them. You did." His mouth worked once. "I reckon the birds knew better than we did." Ruth looked past him toward the empty cottonwoods. "No," she said. "They were hungry. That was all. We were the ones who had to learn." Spring returned softly to Cinder Creek. No black cloud came over the ridge. No flock poured into Ruth's rows. No sudden miracle covered the creek in wings. This time, every garden looked different. Silas turned his lower ground deep in November and left it ridged for frost. The Enderleys planted mustard before cabbage. Mrs. Mott set boards at the edge of her potato rows and made her boys lift them before breakfast. Flowers appeared at row ends, not for prettiness, but purpose. Men who once laughed at a ledger began asking their wives whether Ruth had written anything about bean rust. The valley did not become humble all at once. People rarely do, but it became observant. By June, the pests came again, as Ruth knew they would. They came smaller. They came into fields prepared to meet them. Worms were found before they multiplied. Beetles gathered on trap rows and were destroyed there. Grubs turned up in soil that had been opened to frost months before. The gardens held. One evening in early July, Ruth stood at the gate with Eli while the sun went down behind the cottonwoods. A few blackbirds moved in the reeds by the creek, ordinary birds now. Not a sky turned into judgment. Eli rested his arms on the fence. "Do you ever wish they had come back?" Ruth watched one bird hop through the ditch grass and lift with a flash of red on its wing. "Yes," she said, "sometimes." Then she looked along Cinder Creek, at one green kitchen field after another, and at the people moving through them slowly, looking closer than they used to. But not because we need them. Mercy Lorne came up the lane then, slower than last year, but smiling the same private smile. "You finally got the whole creek reading the ground," she said. Ruth shook her head. "No," she said. "I got them to stop arguing with it." A blackbird called once from the reeds. Ruth listened until the sound faded. Then she opened her ledger to a clean page and wrote the first line of the new season. "The field will answer if we let it."